I'm Bertram de Souza, host of the Scribbler Publishing Group video podcast, along with my co host Cynthia Rickard, welcoming you to this special postmortem of last Tuesday's general election. The results of the midterm sweepstakes have shown that Ohio may no longer be the political bellwether of the nation, while state after state rejected the extremist policies of Donald Trump's Republican Party. Ohio voters embraced them with a passion. So the question arises, what does the future hold for a state that at one time was seen as a must win in presidential elections? To answer that question and provide other insight into the election in Ohio and the nation, we have invited three veteran political commentators, analysts, and observers. Dr. William Binning, retired political science professor at Youngstown State University and longtime Republican Party insider. Brent Larkin, the Dean of Political Writers in Ohio and retired director of the Cleveland Plain Dealer's editorial page, and Tom Suddas, a faculty member of Ohio University's Journalism School and former Plain Dealer political reporter. Brent and Tom continue to write columns for the paper. Thank you, Bill, Brent, and Tom, for joining us today. Let me start with this. In the pre-election podcast that Bill, Brent, and I participated in, we made predictions in the hotly contested U.S. Senate race, and that featured longtime Mahoning Valley Congressman Tim Ryan and political newcomer, venture capitalist, and Donald Trump ass-kisser J.D. Vance. Bill, you said that Vance would win with a small margin. Brent, you predicted a win for Vance of between 3 and 5%, and I predicted Vance would win by more than 5. According to the latest numbers, I think Vance won by about 6, if that's right. Tom, since you were not able to participate, I'd still like you to talk about this race. It grabbed national headlines, and so let's talk about this Senate race and what happened. Bill, let's start with you.
Well, I think we covered a lot of the ground. I think in general, I don't think Vance was particularly good candidate for Ohio, and so he was sort of a drag compared to the rest of the Republican ticket. But I think that the force of the Republican vote in Ohio dragged him over the finish line, and he won. And it in general election, of course, he won the primary because Trump dragged him over the line. I don't think there was anything particularly surprising. They all predicted he would win, but as you pointed out, by different degrees of margin. I don't think there was anything exceptional about the race, except for one thing, and we did bring up the point about Ryan's complaint about the Democrats deserting him. I think given the results, the Democrats probably made a good choice. I don't know if having another $10-20 million is going to make much difference in the outcome of the race. And they did say they got the majority, which is what they were. I mean, Democratic Senate caucus got the majority in national elections. So,
Brent?
I think it's important to note that, and we weren't sure of this 2 weeks ago when we were here, that Tim Ryan didn't leave his base. But his base left him.
Right.
We found that out on November 9th. I believe he lost his congressional district. Is that right?
Yes, he did.
He lost his congressional district. If he had run for re-election against someone other than that crackpot he ran against 2 years ago,
Right.
he might have lost.
Sure.
And for all the pandering that Tim did to the Trump base, he ran only 1.5% better than Joe Biden ran 2 years ago. So all that pandering came to almost no good.
Tom?
I made a note to myself, and I don't recall what the margin was on our email when the final election came out. That Vance would carry 54% of the vote. Is that about what he carried?
It's about what he carried, yes.
Thank you. And it was, I'm usually wrong about things, but that time I got lucky. My own feeling is that the state is in a long-term secular change, politically speaking, unless Democrats get their act together. To me, the most striking thing, and it shouldn't be because I'm from there originally, was the fact that Mr. Vance carried Trumbull and Mahoning counties,
Yes,
which should have been heartland country for Ryan. And you think about it,
right.
maybe not so much anymore, but it could have been, it should have been in the first place. That somewhat surprised me. But the margin did not surprise me because I think that Democrats have kind of run out of gas in the state right now until they get a better message or a better messenger. Going to be stuck in a minority for a while. And this symbolized it because you can't say that Ryan didn't work extremely hard in campaigning. I think Brent himself has observed it. It's one of the better retail campaigns he's ever seen in recent years in Ohio. I think that's true. But you can't get past the fact that there's still a lot of symbolism in the Republican brand and in the Trump brand, which is what carried, I think, Mr. Vance into victory.
Um, so while the predictions of most so-called political experts of a red tsunami sweeping the nation was wrong, in Ohio, blood red, in my opinion, was the color of choice. Republicans swept all statewide offices, have a firm grip now on the Supreme Court, which is significant. So the question that I have is, and for three of you, what does the future hold for this state? And Brent, let's start with you.
It's not going to change in one or two or this is Trump. Trump got everyone's attention in 2016, but Ohio has been trending that way for a very long time. We've had a governor for all of 4 years, a Democratic governor for all of 4 years
Right.
in the last 32. So I think the Democratic Party is going to have to reassess this notion that they're going to go back and take those blue collar, workers back into their fold, because maybe they're not going to do that. And their future might be with the college to pay more attention to the college educated moms and men, although men are going to be a perpetual problem for the Democratic Party. And that's where their future may lie in places like Franklin County,
Sure.
Delaware County, which is Hamilton County, and to a lesser degree, Cuyahoga.
Tom?
My view is that the Republican legislature will probably overreach itself. It can't help doing that because of the numbers they have right now. And I think that inevitably a reaction will form to some of the more radical things that get enacted by the legislature. As you know, because of the margins, the legislature's wound up on the GOP side of the ledger. They basically are no fetters on what they want to do right now. They're
Right.
veto proof, number one, over the governor's vetoes. And number two, they can pass, if the numbers hold in the House, any emergency measure they wish to, which avoids referendum possibilities against that particular measure. I have a feeling, though, that as with any group of men or women, politically speaking, that are in an overwhelming position, they will tend to overreach at some point and do something or some things that will cause a reaction to their politics, and that may help give Democrats an opening. However, I want to throw in one thing. What reminds me uncannily of the Democrats'
Right.
situation right now was the Republicans during the long 22 years in which Vern Reif and A.G. Lancione was Speaker of the House. It can be easy to be in the minority. I don't mean that as a knock or a criticism of character. You go to your committee hearings and do your work, and you show up to vote on the floor and get your paycheck and everything else. But beyond that, if your seat's relatively safe, you don't have to do much else. And so, in that respect, there's a problem of complacency in the Republican and Democratic Party right now. I think just saying there's some other magic pill that's going to change all this. It's not going to change all that. What's going to change all of it is, first of all, hard work, and then two, spotting opportunities when the Republicans overreach in Columbus.
Hey, Bill, you've been a Republican insider. You were for a long time. Is this your Republican Party that now controls Ohio?
Before we get into that, when we talked about what happened in the election, at least to me, it was surprising that the Democrats won 5 congressional seats. They won that Sykes seat. They won the Cincinnati seat that they've been struggling for, and the other 3 seats that they had. So in some respects, in this thin margin nationally in the House, the Democrats in Ohio contributed to that, because I think I don't know what the others think, but I think they overachieved in some respects. I don't remember what is that? Do they have 15 seats? They have 5. they got a third. They haven't been that strong in a long time, and that's with the. We thought these Republicans knew what they were doing when they gerrymandered the state, but apparently, at least with the congressional district, those are not even recounts. Those seats. I think they're firmly in control of the Democrats who won.
Right.
And so I just wanted to throw that in. I was a little surprised at that at the number if you think about it. I don't know, but what I'm supposed to think about the Republican Party. I'm not. I think a lot of this, a lot of the problems this year. I'm with the chorus. Trump screwed a lot of this up. He wouldn't stop talking about the fact he lost the race, made that central, and he recruited a lot of these candidates who turned out to be pretty poor candidates. And so I'm part of that chorus that we don't need Trump going forward. You ask me where am I in the Republican Party? I hope the Republican Party going forward nationally goes forward without Trump as the nominee.
Well, he's expected to announce tomorrow.
Yeah.
And the thinking is that he is going to announce that he's going to seek again to run again in 2024. What does that do to the Republican Party? Anyone?
Are you
Go ahead.
asking me?
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Well, everybody has a right to run, but he may not end up getting the nomination. At least the current set of polls that we see, DeSantis is leading in a lot of circles, and with the elite conservative media, at least the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, et cetera, they're drum beaters for getting rid of Trump and going with DeSantis. So I think if DeSantis gets in, it'll be pretty hotly contested. But I expect other candidates to get in as well.
Can I
go ahead.
want to ask something. So we're talking about Ohio being a red state. For an independent voter like myself and a progressive, it's a little bit frightening to me. And I'm wondering what you all know about all this gerrymandering. Is how long will it be, or is it possible at all for a Democrat or a progressive to win in this state? Because I had friends of mine texting me on election night saying, it's time to move to Michigan, it's time to move to Pennsylvania. I mean, it's pretty depressing for someone who believes in women's reproductive rights to see what's going on in our state right now.
My wife wants New Zealand, but Pennsylvania's a lot closer.
I'll go with her.
Go ahead, Brent.
Well, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. I don't think this state, you don't turn things around like that. However, a couple of you mentioned the district that I live in. Sykes they flipped that district because it was kind of, although Summit County was all carved up, but the Republicans nominated a former, I think she was Miss Ohio or something, and she was an absolutist on the abortion issue, an extremist on it, actually. And I think that's what beat her. I'm going to go back to Bill's point for just 1 second. I want Trump to run, and I want him to win the nomination. So
Thanks. Thank you.
That's my preference. And Rupert Murdoch, who has done more damage as a legal immigrant than any illegal immigrant ever do for the United States of America. They only have one vote, and I think Trump may not be the nominee, but he's got a base that's bigger than anybody else right now today.
Do any of you think that he might go for Speaker of the House? I was listening to some Sunday shows, that were talking about that.
Not smart enough.
I know he's not smart enough, but could that be what he's going to announce?
He wouldn't know what he's doing up there.
Yeah.
Hey,
but I don't see not knowing what he's doing would be the thing that stop him.
No.
I don't see him doing it.
Tom, you've covered and observed and written about presidential politics in Ohio for a long time. There was a time when Ohio was seen as a bellwether state. There was a time when Ohio was, I remember when we used to go to the Republican and Democratic conventions, the Ohio delegation also always had front row seats because, the importance of the state. Um, where does Ohio now stand in the presidential sweepstakes? Is this a state that matters?
I think it's always going to matter as long as it has the electoral votes it has, excuse me. But I do think that the bellwether thing was something of a misnomer in the sense that it was true for a long, long time and could become true again, depending on 2024. But I think also we have to recognize the state has changed immensely from the days when I was a kid in Youngstown.
Right.
And you see 100,000 people in Central Square in 1960 cheering their lungs out for John F. Kennedy,
Sure.
so forth. And compared to today, when you have people screaming their lungs out, at least in a couple of venues like the Covelli Center for Mr. Trump. Part of it's the change in the industrial union picture in our state. Days when the CIO unions really had a huge amount of clout with the auto workers, the steel workers, and so forth. And part of it also is the fact that we have a migration in the state toward suburban Cincinnati, suburban Columbus, some of which is winnable, some of which is not for Democrats. In Columbus, it is. In Cincinnati, who knows? I think I'd like to give us one more time in 24 to see what happens before I make sure that I can determine in my own mind this is no longer a bellwether state. But right now, the electoral votes are important to both sides, no matter whether we're a bellwether or not.
Given what has happened in Ohio, there were states that, over the weekend on the talk shows, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin were mentioned, subtly about what was going on in those states, about what was going to happen in the presidential. And they also talked about the abortion issue and the ballot issue. Now, Democrats in this state are talking about putting a constitutional amendment on the ballot next year. Given the trends, what do you think is going to happen if, in fact, there were a ballot issue next year? Let's start with you, Brent.
If it's a reasonable issue, I think it would pass. And I could be wrong about this, Bertram. I've heard that there's now thinking to put it on the ballot in a bunch of states in 2024.
Okay.
Which might be strategically, I would poll on that before, but I think it would have a chance of passing, even in Ohio. Heck, if it passed in Kansas, it might even pass in Ohio.
Let me take up a point that Tom's making, and that is, we don't know what this legislature is going to do with abortion even in the lame duck or in the beginning of the term. If they go for a total ban, which they could, which they might, and if they do, then I think there's no question that the response is going to be a ballot issue.
Right.
I think there's probably enough energy, enough money in Ohio to put it on. And if they have a total ban and they put it on, and as Brent says, if what the proposal is considered, quote, reasonable, then it'll pass. And I would think that would help Democrats having it on the ballot. And so strategically, when do they want to put it on? Do they want to put it in the odd year? Or do they want to use it as a mechanism for trying to shape the vote in 24? I don't know. I'm not a Democrat. I don't think it is.
I don't know. I think it would be a mistake to tie it to that.
It depends on what the Republicans do with the issue in the next 6 months.
Well, I heard DeWine recently in a recent interview, and I think it was post-election, talking about the abortion issue, and he said they really need to pass something that's agreeable to both sides, something reasonable, he said, which I'm assuming he was kind of pointing to the 15-week time frame. But
I go to Tom or Brent, though. I think that's a new song for DeWine, if that's what he's singing.
Well, and on top of that, he's not leading
total
the party.
ban, wasn't he?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was total ban before the election.
Yeah.
Well,
After the court case, he was in favor of a total ban on abortion.
Yeah.
Remember they had the big deal about the 10-year-old who had to go to Indiana.
Yeah. Yeah. That was horrific. But
So we don't know And it doesn't matter what he says anyway, unless the Republican in the House go for total ban. And does he have the courage to veto that?
Well, that's what Bertram and I were discussing that, and I don't think he uses his power to corral the members of his party to do anything. He's just letting them make the plan, and then he gets off the hook for whatever happens. Because
Well, we
So
saw
he's got to do
very same
something
thing.
to pass a bill, right? He's
We
got to do
saw that.
something to pass a bill.
I'm sorry, Bill, for talking over you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Go ahead, Brett.
But we saw exactly that behavior on the gun bills.
Yeah.
Right. Go
Well,
ahead,
there's a
Tom.
time and a place. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Tom, go ahead. Talk about that.
There's a time and a place for everything about vetoes, and a governor doesn't want to use a veto he's going to lose by having it overridden.
Right.
The difficulty he has right now is that the mix of the new legislature, especially that comes in January 3rd or 2nd, I'm not sure what the date is such that he's going to have a much more conservative legislature than he had up to now, which was no day at the beach either to begin with. He only needs they only need 60 votes to override a veto in the House. They're going to have 68 Republicans probably in the House coming up. And the power of the right to life lobby as a lobby is not to be underestimated. However, I personally believe, and this is, who knows, if I were right, I'd be rich, I suppose, that given the choice of Ohio voters given, let's just say, a Roe versus Wade standard, which is what we had for almost 50 years in
Right.
January, versus something the legislature would cook up, I think the voters would go with the Roe versus Wade standard in Ohio statewide and pretty overwhelmingly.
But I think that would have to be on the ballot on its own, like they did in Kansas.
It would have to be, you're correct.
Yeah,
That's right.
I would really not like to see it tied to the presidential election. I think that would be a big mistake.
That's a good point. I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's a good point.
And then, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say that's a strategic decision on the part of the Democrats, because they certainly arguably would yield some votes for Democrats if it was on, in my opinion, if that was the situation, it was on a ballot. So that it would help, arguably would help the Democrats in 2024.
Now, when we started discussion, we talked about the future of the Democratic Party. And we all remember there was a time when the Democratic Party was strong in Ohio. We covered them, I mean, and sort of, when it was Ohio was purple. So after the election, I got a text from a Democratic Party insider who actually had served in party leadership. And I'm going to read it exactly the way he did, so, pardon the swearing. And here's what he said. He said, among Democrats, it's how we talk to people, Bertram. And the fucking truth is that we have too many woke fucking Democrats in this fucking party. And that's not where people are at. They pick the perfection over the practical, and that's getting shoved up their asses every fucking time. I'm done with politics. And he, in conversation with him, he took great exception to describing Mahoning Valley voters as blue-collar, non-college educated Democratic voters. He thought that was insulting and is the reason why people like Tim Ryan and other Democrats are doing so poorly in this region because of this attitude that seems to be on display. Generally, is the Democratic Party out of touch with the people of Ohio? And let me start with you, Tom, since you write a lot about this.
I think to some extent, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because I know a time when it was not that way, I think it is. And difficulties are enhanced by gerrymandering, which means typically in a Republican district, the most conservative person is going to probably come out and emerge in a primary. In Democratic district, probably the most liberal person is going to emerge as part of the primary. And then whoever gets the seat depends on the overall drawing of the districts. Don't misunderstand me. I happen to support many of those things that are considered to be quote unquote woke or whatever the
Right.
are as a private individual. But I think that many people will just assume a position of live and let live about a lot of stuff and not have it perceived to be propagandized at them all the time. And I think that's something that's very important to think about how people approach these issues in the sense of looking at it as neighbor to neighbor, or someone that's one of your betters telling you how to be a better person or something, which is a whole lot different than that. I think there is a cultural clash that way. I don't know the answer to it. I think it would always help if we will take into consideration that I think on balance, people, generally speaking, have goodwill with other people and they know that some sensitivity is called for, but not to be maybe constant virtue signaling about how they must act or they have to act because it's the right thing to do.
Brent?
I think, well, there is a lot of after every gubernatorial race for the last 30 years, there's just criticism bubbles up about the Democratic Party, and it's happening again. I think it's also related to turnout issues and candidate quality. And Andrew Tobias at the Plain Dealer had a story quoting a bunch of people critical of the party today. And I did an interview with, I mentioned this briefly in my columns Sunday, that Dick Celeste was very critical of the party in its efforts in this past election. But make no mistake, and we all know this is Sherrod Brown's Democratic Party.
Right.
He put all these people in here, and I'm sure this is coming up on your menu there, Bertram.
Yes.
But he's going to have to consider how this party acts going forward, sometime within the next 24 months when his future's on the line.
Bill, before we talk about Sherrod Brown and his role, especially with the governor's race, talk about the Democratic Party, because you spent a lot of time with Mahoning Valley Democrats, good and bad. In fact, towards the end, you and Trafficant ended up being friends. Is there a problem with the way the Democratic Party has treated its rank and file hardcore members?
I don't know, but one of the things that struck me in the post-election analysis nationally was that the argument was that the key vote for holding the Democrats up on what we thought was going to be a bad year for them was the young vote. They came out and they voted heavily Democratic. Now you think of Mahoning Valley, there are no young people.
Yes.
And I think that's part of the problem. I think we think about what's happened in the Mahoning Valley. A sizable percentage of people on Social Security, the vote, probably the greatest percentage in the state. So you're talking about a very different demographic than the demographic that held the Democrats up nationally. If with this argument, they didn't expect the young people to come out, and they didn't expect to come out that strongly and vote that heavily Democratic. Well, that wasn't going to happen in Mahoning Valley because there are no young people.
Yes.
Parties in the young people.
That's 100% correct, by the way.
Go ahead, Tom.
That's 100% correct. I thought, to me, one of the most striking things about Mayor Whaley's campaign, as far as her stark speech, was that people shouldn't have to go to Columbus to find work after they finish college or finish high school. And I can't tell you how many friends of friends or the children of friends or the grandchildren of friends from Mahoning County have been very successful in their lives, but it's because they got their degrees at Youngstown State, a great place, and they went on to work elsewhere in the state because that's where the opportunity was.
Right.
So we have a kind of a skewed sample of Mahoning right now, quote unquote Democrats, not skewed in any negative way, just because of demographics, because younger people have opportunities elsewhere, and that's where they go. And I think that's a real problem in the state, evening out opportunities across our state in every region. And that's something that hasn't been addressed by Columbus very well lately.
Brent, in preparing for this, I looked at the 2020 census in Ohio, the demographics. And my conclusion is Ohio has become a state for old people. There's the growing population of senior citizens, a stagnant middle-age population, exodus of young people. And so the question that arises is, can Ohio, given its political climate, attract young people to the state or keep young people here? I don't know about your kids, but I know Bill's kids even though he was chairman of the political science department at YSU, his kids are no longer in the Mahoning Valley. So, how do you do that? How do you change this demographic?
Well, the best way to do it, I suppose, is the way it's happening right. And Tom alluded to this. Central Ohio is going to have the best economy in the state. If it probably does now,
Right.
and it's only going to improve with Intel and any related businesses that pop up surrounding that, and it will attract more students to Ohio State's engineering department, with young people hoping to get a degree in computer science. That it's going to be a growing field in Central Ohio. I'm not too sure how you change the lack of. We're an undereducated population generally in Ohio. We all know that. Central Ohio, again, is going to prove to be the exception to that rule.
Sid, got any?
Well, yeah, I was thinking along the same lines because I saw the new Gen Zer member of Congress over the weekend, and he was so impressive, and it made me wonder, where are our Gen Zers? And then I had a discussion with a young friend of mine who goes to school out of state, but she still lives here and came back to vote here. And I asked her if any of her friends were voting, and she said, I don't think any of them know there are elections besides presidential elections. And that said to me that both parties are falling down in their job to educate young people about how elections work and about how our government works and about how our country runs. I've been working the polls for the past few years since the paper closed, and suggested to some of the board members that they go into high schools and recruit high school civics students because they're short on poll workers to come there, and they tell me there are no civics classes in high school anymore. I mean, it seems like there's a big failing across the board to even educate our young people. Do any of you have any insight on that?
Bill, you've been involved both as academic and.
Well, I think we already pointed out that what we don't have in a relatively strong population group is young people.
Right.
I mean, we don't really know what the turnout was among the young voters in Mahoning or Trumbull County, and we don't know how they voted. They may have voted like their national contemporaries, but they're not a significant number. They're outnumbered by a much older generation, and you're thinking about that. Bertram, you know that Columbiana County is the same way. It's become so red.
Yes.
But if you look at the demographics, it is an old county. The people there are old.
Yep.
And even though the Johnson can gin up a 70% vote for the Republican candidate, he's bringing older people to the polls. There are no younger people in Columbiana County.
And it was those old people. Bill,
educated them.
It was those old people, Bill, in Columbiana County that was responsible for the person you have mentored for a long time.
One of my top students.
One of your top students, Mark Hanai, winning the 7th District Court of Appeals race as a Republican, whose father was longtime Mahoning County Democratic Party chairman, who was a Democrat for a long time. And he beats a well-established, well-liked, well-qualified, incumbent judge, D'Onofrio, because of what Johnson was able to do in the rest of the district from Columbiana County.
Maybe Bertram, that is the maybe Mark Hanna is the fruit of the R on the judicial ballot.
Yes.
Yes.
That's people. That's what they were voting for. They were voting for the R because it wasn't name ID. Both of them had
Right.
fairly name ID,
Right.
and the Hanai name is a soured name.
Yes.
And I think it was that R next to Mark's name. And what did he get? He got 60, 70% of the votes south of Mahoning County.
And in fact, Dave Johnson told the voters, just vote the R's.
Yeah.
Don't worry about the names. Don't worry about who they are. Don't worry about whether you know them. Just vote the R. And that brings the question I was going to ask all three of you is about the Supreme Court and the judicial races where party ID was on the ballot. When Donald Trump came here for a rally, there were Supreme Court candidates who attended that rally. Now, you know, the separation of the courts and mainstream politics no longer exists. And to me, that is really disturbing. And I don't know how you guys feel. So, Tom, let me go with you and then we'll go to Brent. Give me your take on this.
I myself, and I'm not exactly a goody two-shoes about life or politics, thought it was tasteless, at a minimum, for them to be at that rally. I will say you that excuse me, I'm showing my age, in 2020, I believe Justice Kennedy and then Justice French attended a Circleville rally for Mr. Trump as well. That wasn't publicized that well. I thought it was a very big mistake of all kinds to kind of breach that boundary, which is kind of unspoken there, but nevertheless, I think should be in existence between partisanship on the presidential campaigns and judicial campaigns in Ohio. But someone in Columbus got the bright idea that, and it's true, that the so-called nonpartisan, i.e. non-labeled ballot was disadvantageous to parties that didn't have a good name, so to speak, on the ballot for a given post, and they went ahead and did it. And I have to say, as someone who's from Youngstown, I was floored by the Judge D'Onofrio.
Yes.
Yeah.
Judge D'Onofrio and Mark Hanna outcome, because of the fact it just made no sense. It makes sense to me now.
Right.
It made no sense to me about those sort of mixtures of politics and the judiciary. This is not supposed to be the way it's supposed to be in Ohio.
Brent?
I wrote a column about this, and in a nutshell, Judges Fisher, DeWine,
Yes.
and Justices Fisher, DeWine, and Kennedy attended the rally that you referenced.
Right.
And worse than that, a day later, Laura Bischoff in the Dispatch interviewed them, and two of the three, Fisher and Kennedy, refused to say that the 2020 election was legitimate. That terms like that's essentially what.
Right.
And to me, that's disqualifying. These jokers are going to sit up on the bench and interpret the laws and the Constitution of this state. I think that automatically makes them unfit. And DeWine, you know, from everyone I've heard from, mostly within the Republican Party, about Justice DeWine, if his name was Larkin, you know, he'd be pushing a pencil somewhere deep into some prosecutor's office. And
Right.
it's a sad state on the commentary and the Supreme Court, in terms of being run, it's now going to be run by a legal lightweight.
Yes.
She will be the Chief Justice,
Yes.
as opposed to Maureen O'Connor, who made some really courageous decisions that prompted a lot of creeps in the legislature to call for her impeachment. And while we're on the subject of Trump rallies, Mike DeWine, John Husted stood there last Monday night in Dayton when Trump told, 500 or 600 lies, borrowed a page from the Nazi playbook and described Nancy Pelosi as an animal.
Yeah.
And it was a classless act on their part. So,
Bill, let me ask you this. This is not the kind of party that you first became involved in. This party has not only been corrupted by Donald Trump, but it has lost its moral underpinnings. as far as I'm concerned, having covered politics in Ohio for 40 years. I have never seen a party that is so blatantly political and is willing to break all rules, such as the Supreme Court. What does that do to the court when you have justices who have no qualms about embracing, politicians?
Well, I think that this, of course, all of us have been down this road, and we know over the decades, the Bar Association and other good government groups have tried to go to a merit system,
Right.
and Ohioans are just unwilling to give up their right to vote for whatever fools are on the ballot, and not take any interest in their qualifications or their character. But in a lot of ways, I think this particular judicial election was driven
Yeah.
was driven by the redistricting issues.
Right.
I think that O'Connor fueled this. That is that the Republicans were stirred up and they looked upon the judiciary as theirs. She was supposed to be. She was one of Alex's proteges. Is that right, Tom? And she came out of the Akron
Precisely.
Right.
machinery, and look what she double crossed us. and so now, and that's going to be interesting. Now we're talking about the abortion issue. That's another issue that is going to be addressed. And I don't know if the Democrats have enough energy if they're going to go to the ballot with abortion, which they probably will be able to do. Are they going to be able to go to the ballot with any kind of reasonable redistricting constitutional language? Because the language that we have simply doesn't work. And to go back to your point about the court, it's the court that's might determine that this redistricting is okay, even though it's dysfunctional. But I don't know if we're going to see. I don't know if there's enough energy to go to the ballot with an issue. I was interested in Brent or Tom's view as to whether there's enough energy in Ohio to go to the ballot, because that constitutional language is dysfunctional. That we learned that, and the court is a party to it. And I think that's what happened to the court in this election. It was really about the redistricting issue to the Republicans. That's why there was so much energy and so much money to win that Chief Justice. What they spent $2 or $3 million on her race, and Gruner had what, $500,000.
Right. But O'Connor, Chief Justice O'Connor, in siding with the Democrats in the court, stood on principle and talked about what in the constitutional amendments on redistricting, what the people of Ohio were actually saying. She was clear about that. But the Republicans didn't care.
Yeah.
They don't care what.
No, they don't care.
And
No, they wanted to control the redistricting.
Exactly. And so you're right, Bill. In this next court, the redistricting issue is going to disappear because it's not going to become an issue, right? Brent and Tom?
Well, my bigger concern is, that's going to happen for sure. And in response to what Bill said, I do think there's energy to take an abortion amendment, a referendum, or whatever you want to call it, to the ballot. I think redistricting is something that the average Ohioan probably thinks is some kind of inside baseball stuff for the politicians. Unfortunately, it's not. It affects their lives directly. But I do agree with Bill to some extent. I haven't thought about this until the last couple of days, that a lot of what drove Republican voting against, a lot of voting for the Republican justices was the fact that there's really anger out there, but somehow the chief was supposed to follow the lead of the party on that, and she didn't, which of course is absurd from the point of view of principle, but that's the way it goes in Columbus. This is not a state that is high in philosophy. It's in practical politics.
Brent?
Well, this is a woman, and to follow up on what Tom, she has been a conservative Republican for her whole life, dating back to being a prosecutor in Summit County, and the lieutenant, a heartbeat away from being governor of Ohio briefly.
Right.
And to treat her like that, it's a reflection on their lack of character.
So tell me, because I'm one of those Ohioans who I see the districts. I don't quite know how the whole process works, but can it be fixed? I mean, can there be a more fair map drawn? Or are we just left to whatever the Republicans say it's going to be?
Bill?
Well, I have two thoughts on that. One is, I think the Democrats are not going to be that enthusiastic about redrawing the congressional boundaries.
Right.
Now that they have 5 members, that's a boost for them in Ohio, and the incumbents. I don't know, in the political science textbooks, the incumbents have a great influence on the districts, and so I would think, and we have the masterful Vernon Sykes out there, and I don't see a big push to change the way they do congressional redistricting. And I don't think people really understand the state legislative redistricting very well anyway.
Right.
And so I don't know we're going to see they're going to see much interest in this. And as you pointed out, if they draw some new stuff, they're still going to have a court that's favorable to them. So I think the Republicans are going to run roughshod over this for the next 6, because these districts are only good. The districts are only good. They're not even good for this coming election,
Right.
right, Tom? They've got to redo. They have to do
Redraw
redistricting
them
for
again.
24,
But then
and it's just going to go on like this.
it'll be the same people that are drawing the maps, right?
That's what I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bertram, can I add something briefly?
Please do.
It's in Cuyahoga County, voters, in their lack of wisdom, elected 2 removed from office 2 highly qualified Republicans on Tuesday. One who received perhaps the best bar association ratings I've ever seen, but she has a bad ballot name, and another guy named Callahan who lost to an O'Donnell. O'Donnell's always going to be better than a Callahan. And so my point is, up here in this county, in Cuyahoga County, voters have elected some atrocious judges,
Right.
especially judges. And this goes back 30, 40 years. If you have
Bertram would agree that they're still up to it. Isn't that right, Bertram?
What's that?
I said you would agree that Ohioans are still electing atrocious
Of
judges.
course they are.
On you are, Mark, can't I?
And
And I have to say, if the Vindicator was still in business, he would not be on the bench.
absolutely. And I
But that's
had a
another check.
conversation.
That's another point
Right.
about Ohio politics. That one of the checks that we had was the press.
Right.
We don't really have a press that has influence. They don't stir up. The Senate Bill 6 could have come to life. A lot of
Exactly.
things could have happened if we were in the 70s and the newspaper, the Plain Dealer and the Dispatch were still alive. It's still stirring up trouble for the politicians.
Remember
and-
CoinGate?
But we don't have that anymore. But
Well,
anyway,
yes. Newspapers still matter, but only a fraction of.
exactly.
Right.
But they don't drive the agenda the way they used to.
No.
Or destroy people the way Bertram would if he had his chance to go after Mark.
Tom was a member of the Bureau, the Plain Dealer Bureau in the 80s that wreaked havoc with all of state
Yes.
government and single-handedly drove a bunch of judges up, Judge threw the Celebrezze family off the court.
Right.
And
We don't
was
have that kind of
totally
juice.
the work of the Plain
You
Dealer.
don't have that juice anymore. Papers don't have
No,
that.
not even
That's
close.
another reason that the state is collapsed. Its character's collapsing because of the internet. It's not the paper.
Right.
It's taken the place of newspaper.
So before we leave, for each of you, to those of us who drank a lot election night, and those of us who prayed a lot election night, given the outcome of what's happening in Ohio, what can we expect politically in this state in the coming years? And Bill, I'm going to start with you, since you were, the inner circle of the Jim Rhodes
That was a long time ago.
era. So go
I'm
ahead
not
and
in
tell
it.
me.
I'm not in the inner circle of the current. I think Tom's got it. Is the one who usually has his finger on it in
Right.
the state, and that is, we really don't know what the caucus leaders are thinking, and what they have to do to keep their members in line. And that's really what we're going to see in the beginning of the year. Is we're going to see the legislation on abortion, legislation maybe on guns, and so that's what I think That's what I don't know what's going to happen. And there's going to be a lot of leadership fights too, which is going to fuel this, right, Tom? In the House, at any rate, that probably the most conservative faction will probably take control of the House agenda. So I think the most interesting place is going to, not only to very few of us, is going to be the House in Columbus, because I think that's where a lot of the fighting in the East going to be in the Republican Party.
Tom?
I think the next 4 years will tell us, and this will sound a little bit grandiloquent, but what kind of character Mike DeWine really has. Because there's a very good chance that unless he vetoes a lot of things the legislature passes, they're going to become law. Or even if he does veto them, they'll
Yes.
become law.
Yes.
But if he takes a stand on some of these things, he can make or break his biography down the road. Because right now it's going to be very easy to shrug and say, well, I can't do much about it given the votes in the legislature. Yes, you can. That doesn't mean at least you can take a stand on records and matters of public interest. And a lot of them right now are going to be very, very high profile because this General Assembly is going to take on things like transgender
Yes.
people, sexual minorities, reproductive rights, gun ownership, or gun crimes, I should say, actually, in many respects, in terms of criminal law and so forth. And so it's micro break time for Mike DeWine's heritage, as far as I'm concerned.
Brent?
I totally agree with what Tom said. 62% of the vote is, by any definition, a mandate. And as we've alluded to before, he hasn't used his bully pulpit. He's been reluctant to use it for his entire first term. It's time for him to.
He keeps jumping back and forth, as you pointed out. At first, he was for a total ban on abortion, wasn't he?
Right.
Before the election, didn't they say that after the
point,
court decision?
Yes.
he was for total ban.
Yeah.
And you're reporting that he's now kind of, something more reasonable. So we really don't know where he stands.
Even on the gun issue, Bill, after the Dayton massacre, he was big on the red flag and all of that, and then all of a sudden he changed the position. Yeah. So I thank you three, Bill, Brent, and Tom. I'm hoping we can do something on at some point, and I'll think about it and talk to you about it before we figure it out, on minorities, on black voting. And voting in the inner cities and urban areas. But before I leave you, I'm going to leave you with this thought that has given me little encouragement. I believe next year recreational marijuana is going to be on the ballot, and that gives me hope, because those of us who worry about this state can sort of disappear into the ether with marijuana. So. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Okay, good night.
Thank you. Good seeing you
Good
all.
to see you all.
Bye.
Bye.
See everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bertram.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, we've come to the end of another informative podcast. Thanks to our three knowledgeable guests, Dr. William Binning, Brent Larkin, and Tom Suddas. The fallout from last Tuesday's general election in Ohio will be felt for a long time to come. Next year, if Democrats have their way, Ohio voters will be asked to enshrine in the state constitution protections for women's reproductive rights. We hope to use this podcast to shine the light on this important issue and give women who believe in the right to choose a megaphone. Bertram and I are veteran journalists who worked for decades for the now closed Youngstown Vindicator. We, along with other longtime newspaper staffers, published the book No Holds Barred, which is dedicated to the 150-year-old Vindicator. The book can be purchased at Barnes & Noble in Boardman or online at our website, scribblergroup.com. If you've enjoyed these podcasts, which are streamed on the Scribbler Group YouTube channel and Facebook page, WFFJ.com, and other digital platforms, please like and share them and hit the subscribe button. Thanks for tuning in.